Before I begin, let me say that the words I'm about to deliver touch on themes of violence and in particular sexual violence. I want to encourage anyone who might feel themselves triggered to take a step away and take care of themselves. Now more than ever, it's most important that we take care of one another and look out for ourselves and our own well-being. A long time ago, in a place far from here, there was a pair of twin cities. Well, not cities like Los Angeles, but large urban centers nonetheless. Now, looking from afar, the two towns, linked as they were by a shallow valley, appeared as if they were holding hands. One day, as the early morning fog dissipated and the people of the twin cities began to stir, a young girl poked her head out of a doorway. She looked around, checking to see if the sun had risen, for she knew very well the dangers of wandering the streets at night, and had learned long ago to keep a keen eye. Feeling secure, she grabbed her cloak, small empty bag, and the family water pitcher before making her way through the neighborhood. After stopping by the miller to pick up some fresh flour, she went to the local well. There, she came across another young girl who had just finished drawing water. The girl smiled when she recognized the figure as a friend of hers who lived just a couple streets over, but whom she hadn't seen for quite some time. They embraced and exchanged pleasantries, asking after each other's families, when the girl noticed that her old friend didn't look so good. Her cheeks were thinner and her arms weaker than she remembered. "Are you okay, my sister? You don't look well," she asked. "Oh, I'm all right," the other girl responded. She was never a very good liar. "Well, we've come on some hard times lately, and we've barely had enough money to keep a roof over our heads, so we've had to cut back on certain things." The girl thought to herself as a look of shock and embarrassment fell over her face. How could this be possible? There's so much abundance and plenty in the city. After hesitating for but a moment, she leaned over, grabbed the sack of flour from her belt, and began to dump it into her unfilled pitcher, constantly checking her periphery for potential onlookers. She deftly switched the two pitchers, taking the water from her friend and placing it with her pitcher, now filled with flour. Amidst the exchange, the girls clutched one another's hand and gave each other a knowing look, wordlessly exchanging thank yous and your welcomes, but doing their best to conceal this deed. For in these twin cities, such an act of generosity was highly illegal and subject to harsh punishment. Eventually, word of this act of kindness between two girls reached the authorities of the town. They tried the girl, who gave her friend some flour, and the court found her guilty. The suitable punishment, according to the laws of this society, was death. She was executed publicly, a sign for all members of the twin towns to know the severity of the crime of helping those in need. This horrific and cruel story comes to us from Bereshit Rabbah, a collection of ancient rabbinic tales and discussions that interpret and often expand upon stories we find in the book of Genesis. It is meant as a demonstration, but one example of the complete corruption that justifies the destruction of the twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. From these tales, we encounter a society guided by greed, exploitation, and the flagrant abuse of power. And in classic Midrashic style, this particular example of Sodom and Gomorrah's wickedness also provides an explanation for a strange part, a peculiarity in the biblical Hebrew. In Genesis 18:21, when God tells Abraham of what lies in store for the twin cities, we read, "The Eternal said, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, their sin so grave. I will go down to see whether they have truly done according to its cry that came to me." Now, the key part of that verse is the phrase, "its cry." One thing that's strange is that its is singular, not plural, even though there are two cities mentioned. And another peculiar thing is that the gender of its is feminine. In biblical Hebrew, words must be feminine or masculine. Its cry could then be translated as her cry. So the verse could be read as God saying, I will go down to see if they have truly done according to her cry that came to me. For the rabbis, or at least for this particular midrash, the her who cried out to God is that very same girl who gave her friend some flour at the well, the girl who was punished for being kind. As Rabbi Helen Plotkin puts it in a 2019 article, it was the cry of a young girl that caught God's attention and compelled God to act. A cry not loud, but thin and true. The image of this righteous girl crying out to God caught the imagination of the Jewish tradition, and for many, she has become the symbol of the sin of Sodom. Now, the symbol of this righteous girl punished by a cruel society is truly terrible. But I think it's safe to say that when people refer to the sin of Sodom, they are not referring to the story of the girls at the well. For centuries, the dominant interpretation of the tale of Sodom and Gomorrah is that the supposed sin of Sodom was homosexuality. Terms like sodomy and sodomite and the homophobic ideology that informs them have inflicted immense harm on LGBTQ plus folks throughout history and continues to do so today. Many use this story to argue that violence against queer folks is divinely sanctioned. Again and again, it has been wielded as a weapon, stoking the flames of hatred and bigotry for generations. And unfortunately, the pain of these terms is something that this community here at Kol Ami knows all too well. But this interpretation of the Sodom and Gomorrah story is not the only one, and it is certainly not the way the ancient rabbis understood it. The biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah tells of when God's two messengers arrive in town after visiting Abraham and Sarah, and they arrive at Lot's house, who welcomes them in to eat and rest for the evening. Upon hearing of the arrival of these strangers, a group of men arrived outside of Lot's house, demanding that he present his two guests so that, quote, they may know him. The particular verb used in this verse, to know in biblical Hebrew, tends to carry a sexual connotation. The desire of these men of Sodom to exploit strangers in such a way is what led to interpretations of the story as condemning homosexuality. But the ancient sages don't seem to agree. In an interpretation from the Babylonian Talmud, Rabbi Huda does recognize a sexual element of this society's transgressions. He interprets the description of Sodom as being wicked to mean having committed sins with their bodies. But he proves this point by connecting this moment with another story in the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. There, he explains, when Potiphar's wife seeks to sleep with Joseph, the same word for wicked is used. What Rabbi Huda teaches us through this comparison is that the transgression of the men of Sodom demanding to know these strangers is not their sexual orientation, but rather their desire to exploit those seen as powerless and vulnerable. In the Joseph story, Joseph was a slave and servant in Potiphar's household. Potiphar's wife then held the power in that relationship and sought to use it as a means of exploiting Joseph for her own gain. So too in the story of Sodom. The wandering strangers did not have the safety of shelter or status within the community, and those in power sought to exploit this vulnerability. The sin of Sodom, then, was not homosexuality, but the powerful preying upon the powerless, the strong exploiting the weak and the defenseless. The other tales we find in this section of the Talmud tell of the cruelty and injustice of the Twin Cities. We hear of predatory loaning practices, the exploitation of the earth and its bounty, and a profound hostility towards the stranger and the destitute. In a land with so much abundance, those in power saw newcomers and strangers as threats, not as welcomed guests. Yet despite these tales, the rabbis do not conceive of Sodom and Gomorrah as a lawless society. Quite the opposite, in fact. They saw it as a prime example of the perversion of justice, authorities and legal systems guided by greed and fear of the other, a justice system that lawfully decreed the execution of a young girl who acted out of compassion for her neighbor. It is fitting in this sense that this collection of stories would be included in the tractate called Sanhedrin, section of the Talmud informing the rabbinic legal system, likely included as a list of cautionary tales. Sifting through these sins of Sodom, we encounter many striking similarities, I'm sad to say, with our world today. Those of us committed to pursuing justice and building a more peaceful world might sometimes find ourselves feeling helpless in the face of overwhelming injustice. We know the exploitation of the poor and the stranger. We hear the cries of innocent children, unsure of where their next meal will come from. We see the perversion of justice throughout our legal system. And we also know the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I think many of us fear that we will meet a similar end. Not by any act of God, but by the cruelty and callousness of human beings. But if we remember the entirety of the story, we will recall Abraham's challenge to God that if there were enough righteous among the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, God would spare the Twin Cities. There weren't there, but I believe that there are here. As we'll learn more about tomorrow, the stories we hear on Rosh Hashanah show our ancestors at their worst. They, like us, are flawed, capable of inflicting immense harm. But as we move into this new year of 5782, I hope that we can also remember these figures at their best and do our best to emulate them in those moments. I pray that we, like Abraham, can fight on behalf of the vulnerable among us, that we, like Abraham, are unwilling to watch the innocent suffer for the sins of those in power. There are so many problems to be fixed, as our social media feeds are quick to show us every day. It can feel overwhelming. It's a lot. This past year and a half has been a lot. These past couple of weeks have been a lot. Yet our tradition teaches us that though we are not obligated to complete the work at hand, neither are we free to desist from it. We need but lower our heads and narrow our focus. In order to narrow our focus, I hope that we can learn yet another lesson from the ancient rabbis. As they teach us in the story about the two girls at the well, it was not just the systemic cruelty of Sodom and Gomorrah, but the particular individual cry of one victim that garnered God's attention. In this coming year, what is the one cry, the one issue that calls to you and demands your attention? It could be one of the initiatives we address as part of our Tzedek Council here at Kol Ami, or it could be elsewhere in the community. The harsh reality is that we as individuals, and even as part of this sacred community with all its strength and resolve and commitment, cannot possibly remedy all the wrongs of the world on our own. But if each of us opens our ears and our hearts to the one voice crying out to us, one voice thin and true, and work to respond to it over this next year, we can make a difference in our world. And in doing so, may we all be remembered for the good that we brought into our community. And may we be among the righteous that save us from the horrible fate of those ancient twin cities. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will. Ken Yehi Ratzonenu, may it be our will. And let us say, Amen.